June 21, 1940. A British pilot soars through the night sky over the English Channel, not on a combat mission, but on a hunt for something invisible, something the Germans believe cannot be detected. His radio receiver crackles to life, and suddenly he hears it. A steady, rhythmic signal. Dots and dashes. Morse code in the sky. But there's no one transmitting to him. What he's discovered is a secret weapon. One that could tell German bombers exactly where to drop their payload, even in pitch darkness, even through clouds and fog. A weapon that could level British cities with surgical precision. This is the moment Britain realized they weren't just fighting a conventional war. They were fighting an invisible war. A war of radio waves, electromagnetic beams, and radar pulses. A technological chess match where one wrong move could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. The Germans had created the world's first precision-guided bombing system. But what they didn't know was that Britain was listening. And what Britain discovered would change the course of World War II. Forever. This is the story of how a handful of brilliant scientists, using the world's first operational radar network, uncovered Germany's most closely guarded secrets. This is the story of the Battle of the Beams. To understand how Britain stumbled upon Germany's secret weapon, we need to go back to 1935. The world is on the brink of war, and Britain faces a terrifying reality. German bombers could reach London in minutes. There would be no warning, no defense, just devastation raining from the sky. Enter Robert Watson Watt, a Scottish physicist working at the Radio Research Station. In February 1935, the British Air Ministry approached him with a desperate question. Could radio waves be weaponized to destroy enemy aircraft? Watson Watt's answer was no, but he had something better. If you couldn't destroy planes with radio waves, you could detect them. You could see them coming. On February 26, 1935, Watson Watt and his colleague Arnold Wilkins conducted a groundbreaking experiment. They positioned a receiver near a BBC radio transmitter and flew a Handley Page Hayford bomber back and forth. As the aircraft moved, the radio signal bounced back, creating a distinctive pattern. They had just demonstrated the principle of radar, radio detection, and ranging. Britain now had a way to see invisible threats. But detecting aircraft was just the first step. Watson Watt envisioned something far more ambitious. A network of radar stations forming an invisible wall along Britain's coastline. By 1939, this vision became reality. Chain home. 20 radar stations stretching from Southampton to the Scottish Highlands, each one capable of detecting aircraft up to 120 miles away. Some stations could reach out even further, up to 200 miles on a good day. Chain home wasn't just about technology. It was integrated into something called the Dowding System, named after Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding. Radar stations detected incoming aircraft. Observer corps tracked them visually once they crossed the coast, and all this information flowed into operations rooms where controllers directed fighter squadrons with unprecedented precision. For the first time in history, defenders didn't need to keep planes in the air constantly. They knew exactly when and where the enemy was coming. This was Britain's shield. The Germans knew about it. They'd flown reconnaissance missions and seen those massive 350-foot steel towers. But they fundamentally misunderstood what they were seeing. German intelligence concluded these towers were too crude, too simple to be effective. They were wrong, and that miscalculation would prove costly. As 1939 turned to 1940 and the phony war gave way to real combat, chain home proved its worth during the Battle of Britain. Between July and October 1940, RAF Fighter Command used radar intelligence to intercept German raids with devastating efficiency. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was baffled. How did British fighters always seem to be in the right place at the right time? The answer was invisible, pulsing through the air at the speed of light. But while Britain celebrated its technological advantage, German scientists were working on something entirely different. something that would turn the tables in the most unexpected way. November 1939, Oslo, Norway. A British naval attaché receives an anonymous package. Inside is a letter and a small cardboard box. The letter, written in German, makes an extraordinary claim. It contains details of Germany's most secret military technologies. The writer provides instructions. Tune a radio receiver to a specific frequency during a German broadcast, and the device in the box will prove the information is genuine. The naval attaché does exactly that. The device works perfectly. The Oslo report, as it would become known, is authentic. Inside this report is a treasure trove of intelligence. It describes German radar systems called Freya and Würzburg. It mentions magnetic mines, torpedoes, and most intriguingly, it references radio beam technology for guiding aircraft. At the time, most British intelligence officials dismissed the Oslo report as a hoax, possibly German disinformation. But one man took it seriously. Reginald Victor Jones, a 28-year-old physicist who'd just been appointed as the first scientific intelligence officer in the history of British military intelligence. Jones had a unique mind, part scientist, part detective. He understood that in modern warfare, technology could be as decisive as tanks or battleships, and he had a hunch that the Germans weren't just bombing randomly. There was a pattern, a precision that suggested something more sophisticated than simple navigation. Then came the break. In March 1940, a German bomber was shot down, and its wreckage contained something peculiar, a piece of equipment that didn't match any known German navigation system. Around the same time, British interrogators were questioning captured Luftwaffe prisoners. One prisoner let slip a mention of something called Nickebein, German for crooked leg. Another mentioned X-Gerät. These weren't code words for operations. They were technologies. Jones began piecing together the puzzle. He recalled the Oslo report's mention of radio beams. Could the Germans have developed a way to guide their bombers using radio signals? It seemed almost impossible. Radio beams that could maintain accuracy over hundreds of miles? The technical challenges were enormous. Then came confirmation from an unexpected source. In May 1940, Churchill himself had become Prime Minister, and he took a personal interest in scientific intelligence. Jones presented his theory to Churchill and a group of senior officials in June 1940. Some were skeptical. Others thought Jones was chasing phantoms. But Churchill, who had a deep appreciation for scientific innovation, gave Jones permission to investigate further. "Find these beams," Churchill ordered, "and find out how they work." On June 21, 1940, an RAF aircraft equipped with special radio receivers took off on a secret mission. The pilot was Wing Commander Addison, and his assignment was simple but strange. Fly along the path that German bombers typically took and listen. At first, nothing. Then, as the aircraft reached a specific location, the radio burst to life with a rhythmic signal. Dots on one side, dashes on the other. When the pilot flew between them, the dots and dashes merged into a continuous tone. The equi-signal. It was exactly as Jones had predicted. Nickebein was real. And Britain now faced a terrifying truth. Germany had developed the world's first precision-guided bombing system. In darkness, through clouds, through fog, German bombers could navigate with accuracy measured in hundreds of yards. British cities were defenseless against this invisible threat. Understanding Knickebein's genius requires understanding its deceptive simplicity. The Germans had taken existing Lorenz blind landing systems, technology designed to help aircraft land in poor visibility, and weaponized it on a massive scale. They built huge directional antennas on the coasts of occupied Europe, in locations like Kleve in Germany, Stolberg, and later in occupied France. These antennas transmitted narrow radio beams across England. Here's how it worked. One station transmitted a beam with Morse code dots on the left side and dashes on the right. The bomber flew along this beam until it heard the equi-signal, meaning it was perfectly centered. A second beam intersected the first over the target city. When the bomber's receiver detected the second beam, the bomb aimer knew they were over the target. Release the bombs. Mission accomplished. The system operated on frequencies between 30 and 33 megahertz, and it was integrated into the standard Lorenz receivers that German bombers already carried. This was critical. It meant the technology was widespread throughout the Luftwaffe. This wasn't experimental. This was operational. Jones understood immediately that Britain needed countermeasures, and they needed them fast. He proposed a system code-named Aspirin. British transmitters would locate the German beams and then broadcast powerful jamming signals on the same frequency, flooding the German receiver with false dots and dashes. The effect would be to bend the beam, causing German navigators to think they were on course when they were actually miles off target. By August 1940, the first aspirin jammers were operational. Within weeks, Britain had deployed over 50 jamming stations across the country. The results were immediate. German bombing accuracy plummeted. Bombers that thought they were over London were actually dropping their payloads on empty countryside. Towns that should have been devastated remained untouched. But the Germans weren't standing still. Intelligence reports suggested they were developing a new system, something more sophisticated than Nicobine. This one was called X-Jurate, or X-Apparatus, and it was far more dangerous. X-Jurate used a more complex design involving multiple beams. There was the main guiding beam, similar to Nicobine, but then 3 additional crossbeams, Weser, Oder, and Elbe. The bomber flew along the main beam. When it crossed the Weser beam, the bomb aimer started a special stopwatch. When it crossed the Oder beam, they got a warning: approaching target. The stopwatch would then automatically calculate the exact moment to release bombs based on the aircraft's ground speed. When it crossed the Elbe beam, bombs away. X-Jurate operated on higher frequencies, around 60 to 70 megahertz, and required specialized equipment. This meant only elite units could use it, specifically Kampfgruppe 100, a Pathfinder unit. Their job was to arrive first, use X-Jurate to mark the target with incendiary bombs, and then the main bomber force would follow, bombing the fires visually. Jones realized that jamming X-Jurate would be more challenging. The system was more sophisticated, the frequencies were different, and the Germans were learning from their Nicobine failures. But he had an advantage. British intelligence had partially cracked the Enigma code. Decrypts revealed when major raids were planned, which targets were chosen, and sometimes even which beam stations would be activated. The British response was codenamed Bromide, jammers specifically tuned to X-Jurate frequencies. But there was a problem. If you jammed the wrong beam at the wrong time, you'd alert the Germans that their system was compromised. This required precision timing and exceptional intelligence coordination. Throughout the autumn of 1940, this deadly game of cat and mouse continued. The Germans would refine their beams. The British would crack their codes and deploy countermeasures. Then the Germans would develop new tactics. The night sky over Britain had become an invisible battlefield of electromagnetic waves, where the weapons were antennas and the ammunition was radio. Frequencies. November 12, 1940, British. Code breakers at Bletchley Park decrypted a German Enigma message that made their blood run cold. A massive raid was being planned, code-named Moonlight Sonata. The target was clear from the decrypts: a major British city. The timing? The next full moon. The scale? Unprecedented. But there was a problem. The decrypts didn't specify which city. London was the obvious choice. It always was. But intelligence analysts noticed something unusual. The X-Jurate beams were being recalibrated. Signals intelligence suggested the beams were converging not on London, but on a point further north. Multiple cities fit the profile: Birmingham, Wolverhampton, or Coventry. Reginald Jones and his team worked frantically to pinpoint the exact target by analyzing the beam intersections. By November 14th, they had their answer. Coventry, a city of immense strategic importance, home to aircraft factories, munitions plants, and engineering works. The medieval city center, with its Gothic cathedral, was about to face a technological assault from the 20th century. The British faced an agonizing dilemma. They could evacuate Coventry, but that would alert the Germans that Britain had broken Enigma, potentially causing them to change their code system and blind British intelligence for months or years. The alternative was to prepare quietly, deploy jamming equipment, and hope the countermeasures would work. On the evening of November 14, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Moonlight Sonata. Nearly 500 bombers converged on Coventry. Kampfgruppe 100 arrived first, using X-Juret to mark the city center with incendiary bombs. The fires were visible from over 100 miles away. Then came the main force, wave after wave, for 11 straight hours. British jammers fought desperately to disrupt the beams. In some cases, they succeeded. Bombs fell on the outskirts instead of the city center. But there were too many bombers, too many bombs. The cathedral was destroyed. Factories were flattened. Over 500 people died that night, and thousands more were injured. The German propaganda machine coined a new word, Coventrieren, to coventrate, to utterly destroy a city. But here's what the Germans didn't know. It could have been far worse. Analysis after the raid showed that many bombs had missed their intended targets by significant margins. The jammers had worked, just not well enough. And more importantly, the Germans never realized their beams had been compromised. They attributed the scattered bombing to weather conditions and defensive fire. They kept using the same systems, the same codes, the same tactics. From a cold strategic perspective, the Coventry raid provided invaluable intelligence. British scientists now understood exactly how X-Juret operated under combat conditions. They knew its strengths and weaknesses. They could refine their countermeasures, and they did. In the weeks following Coventry, British jamming became increasingly effective. German bombing accuracy continued to decline. Frustrated Luftwaffe commanders began to suspect their equipment was malfunctioning. Some blamed the crews, others blamed the weather. But very few suspected that Britain was systematically dismantling their technological advantage, piece by piece. The Battle of the Beams was far from over, but the tide was beginning to turn. By early 1941, the Germans had one more trick up their sleeve, WWII, or Wotan. This was the most sophisticated beam system yet, and it operated on an entirely different principle. Instead of multiple intersecting beams, WWII used a single beam combined with a transponder system. The ground station transmitted a signal, the aircraft's equipment replied, and by measuring the time delay, the ground station could calculate the exact distance to the aircraft. It was essentially an early form of GPS. WWII allowed ground controllers to guide bombers remotely, telling them exactly when to turn and when to drop bombs. The bomber crew didn't need to interpret multiple beams or operate complex equipment. They just followed instructions transmitted from Germany. It was frighteningly advanced for 1941, but WWII had a fatal flaw. It could only handle one aircraft at a time. The system required continuous communication between the ground station and a single bomber. This made it perfect for elite Pathfinder units, but impossible to scale up for mass raids. Only one Luftwaffe unit, 3 KG-26, was equipped with WWII, and they used it primarily for precision attacks on shipping and specific industrial targets. British intelligence discovered WWII through a combination of signals intelligence and captured equipment. Jones quickly realized that this system was different, more sophisticated, but also more vulnerable. The countermeasure, codenamed Domino, was ingenious. British transmitters would listen for the German ground station's signal, then immediately transmit a false reply before the actual bomber could respond. The German ground station would receive the false signal, calculate an incorrect distance, and give the bomber wrong instructions. Domino was devastatingly effective. Why Jurat operations became chaotic? Bombers received contradictory commands. Some were told they were over the target when they were still over the English Channel. Others flew in circles, confused by impossible instructions. By mid-1941, Jurat was essentially neutralized. The Germans tried to compensate by developing new systems, including a revised version of Jurat operating on different frequencies and using improved encoding. But each time, British intelligence caught up. Enigma decrypts provided advance warning. Radio reconnaissance identified beam frequencies. Jammers were quickly retuned and deployed. What's remarkable about the Battle of the Beams is that it was fundamentally an intelligence victory. British radar, chain home, played a crucial role not just in detecting aircraft, but in detecting the beams themselves. The same receivers that tracked bombers could be modified to track radio signals. Scientists could analyze beam characteristics, map their coverage, and predict their behavior. This intelligence allowed Britain to stay one step ahead. When the Germans changed frequencies, British receivers were already monitoring those frequencies. When the Germans tried new beam patterns, British analysts had already predicted those patterns. It was a technological arms race, but Britain was winning because they understood the game better. By late 1941, the strategic bombing campaign against Britain had largely failed. The Luftwaffe shifted focus to the Eastern Front and the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Blitz ended not just because of RAF Fighter Command's bravery, but because Germany's technological advantage had been systematically dismantled. The beams that once promised surgical precision had become unreliable, inaccurate, and ultimately useless. The Battle of the Beams taught the world several critical lessons about modern warfare. First, technological superiority is temporary. No matter how advanced your weapons, your enemy will adapt, counter, and eventually neutralize them. The Germans learned this the hard way. Their beam systems represented cutting-edge technology in 1940, but by 1942, they were obsolete. Second, intelligence wins wars. Britain's success wasn't primarily due to superior technology. German beam systems were actually more sophisticated than chain home in many ways. Britain won because they understood German technology better than the Germans understood British technology. Enigma decrypts, signals intelligence, scientific analysis, and captured equipment all contributed to a comprehensive intelligence picture that allowed effective countermeasures. Third, integration matters more than individual capability. Chain home wasn't the world's best radar. It was crude, limited, and easily visible. But it was integrated into the Dowding System, which connected radar stations, observer posts, operations rooms, and fighter squadrons into a seamless network. The whole was far greater than the sum of its parts. The legacy of this invisible war extended far beyond. 1945. Radar technology developed during World War II became the foundation for modern air traffic control, weather forecasting, and space exploration. The jamming and counter-jamming techniques, pioneered by Jones and his team, evolved into electronic warfare, a critical component of military operations to this day. The scientists involved went on to remarkable careers. Robert Watson Watt was knighted and became known as the father of radar. Reginald Victor Jones became one of Britain's most respected scientific intelligence officers, later serving as a professor and advising on Cold War defense systems. His memoirs, Most Secret War, provided the first detailed public account of the Battle of the Beams and remain a classic of intelligence literature. Perhaps most importantly, the Battle of the Beams established the principle that wars are won not just on battlefields, but in laboratories and intelligence offices. The Manhattan Project, code breaking at Bletchley Park, the development of jet engines and rockets, all these represented the militarization of science on an unprecedented scale. World War II was the first truly technological war, and the lessons learned shaped how nations approached defense and security for the rest of the 20th century. There's a haunting irony to this story. Germany developed these beam systems because they understood the importance of precision bombing. They knew that random bombing was wasteful and ineffective. They invested enormous resources into technology that could guide bombers accurately to strategic targets. But by the time the war ended, both sides had abandoned precision in favor of mass destruction. The Allied bombing campaigns of 1944 and 1945 didn't need beam guidance. They simply saturated entire cities with incendiary and high-explosive bombs. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima, and Nagasaki represented the ultimate abandonment of precision. Why guide a single bomber accurately when one bomb could destroy an entire city? The beam systems, which seemed so revolutionary in 1940, were rendered obsolete by even more terrible weapons. Yet the fundamental principle remained: see the enemy before they see you. Detect the threat before it arrives. This principle, first embodied in chain-home radar, now underpins every modern defense system, from AWACS aircraft to satellite reconnaissance to cybersecurity. The invisible war that Britain fought in 1940 never really ended. It just moved to new spectrums, new frequencies, new domains. Today, as we develop artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and hypersonic weapons, we're still fighting the battle of the beams. We're still racing to detect threats, decode enemy capabilities, and deploy countermeasures before it's too late. The technology has changed beyond recognition, but the fundamental challenge remains identical. In a world where information travels at the speed of light, victory belongs to whoever sees first and acts fastest. The secret radar that uncovered Germany's war blueprint didn't just help Britain survive World War II. It created a new kind of warfare, one where invisible signals, mathematical calculations, and scientific insight could matter as much as bombs and bullets. In many ways, we're still living in the world that chain-home created. A world where the most dangerous weapons are often the ones you cannot see, and the most important battles are fought by people you'll never hear about, using tools you'll never fully understand. The beam that a British pilot detected on that June night in 1940 wasn't just a German navigation signal. It was a glimpse into the future of warfare. And we're still navigating by those invisible lights today.